My name is Emily Hayes, and the moment the judge announced that I had won the toughest federal case of the year, I saw my father-in-law's smile die right there in the doorway of the courtroom. He had come only out of curiosity, maybe even amusement, expecting to confirm what he'd always believed about me, a woman who probably just drafts paperwork. But when the words, "Attorney Emily Hayes, winner of this year's toughest federal case," echoed across the chamber, his face drained of certainty. The man who had dismissed me for nearly a decade suddenly didn't know who he was looking at anymore. That moment should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like every bruise I had swallowed through the years finally rose to the surface. I remember gripping my legal pad as the photographers clicked away and people reached out to shake my hand. It all blurred together. What stayed sharp, too sharp, was the look in his eyes. Not anger, not even embarrassment. Shock. Raw, unfiltered shock. The kind a man feels when the world he built inside his head collapses in one breath. But that moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It sat on top of years of small digs, quiet humiliations, and the steady erosion of respect from a man who believed he had the right to measure my worth. He didn't start out hating me. That would have been easier. Indifference was worse. Dismissiveness was worse. That little shrug he always gave when someone asked what I did for a living. "Oh, she's a lawyer." Nothing fancy. It chipped away at something inside me that I didn't dare acknowledge, not even to my husband. And it began long before the case that changed everything. The first day I met my father-in-law, Daniel Hayes, he looked me over like I was a resume missing crucial experience. We were at his home in Indiana for Sunday dinner, the kind of gathering where casseroles crowd the table and everyone knows who made what. I remember trying to balance being polite with wanting him to see me as his son's equal, someone with something to offer. I thought my years in law school, my long hours, and the debt I'd taken on showed dedication. But Daniel only asked, "What kind of lawyer are you?" in the same tone someone might use to ask whether a kid prefers crayons or markers. I answered honestly, "I'm hoping to work federal cases someday." He laughed, not loudly, just enough for me to hear. "Federal, oh sweetheart, those cases go to the sharks. Maybe stick to paperwork for now." He meant it kindly, I think. That almost made it worse. My husband, Mark, didn't notice, or chose not to. He had always been close to his father, and I didn't want to wedge myself between them. So I let it go, or told myself I did. But every dig stayed with me. Like Thanksgiving, 5 years later, when the family played a trivia game and someone asked a question about a historic Supreme Court ruling, I answered without hesitation. The table went quiet, and Daniel snorted. "Well, she should know that. All she does is read books all day." The family laughed. Even Mark. I pretended it didn't sting. Even more painful were the quiet moments, the ones no one else saw. When Daniel would compliment my cooking, but never my career. When he asked Mark for advice on property taxes, even though I specialized in financial litigation. When he introduced me to friends, not as my daughter-in-law Emily, but as Mark's wife. "She's a lawyer of some sort." Some sort. That phrase haunted me more than I care to admit. But I kept my head down and worked, quietly, patiently, case by case, client by client. I built a reputation in small circles, first local, then statewide. By the time the federal fraud case involving stolen retirement funds landed on my desk, I had already fought enough battles to know I could handle it. But no one in Mark's family took my work seriously. The case was brutal. A ring of financial predators had wiped out the life savings of hundreds of retirees across the Midwest. People lost everything: homes, medications, dignity. I met veterans who couldn't afford heating oil widows, who were too proud to ask their grown children for money. Grandparents who had to move into cramped, spare rooms because their pensions had vanished. I carried their voices with me everywhere, in my car, in the shower, into my dreams. But at home, Daniel still asked, "So any exciting paperwork this week?" as he reached for the mashed potatoes. I didn't crack. I didn't snap. I didn't even correct him. I just worked harder. Maybe that's why the moment in the courtroom hit me so deeply. It wasn't the victory. It was what the victory revealed. It showed me who I had become, someone who no longer needed validation from a man who'd never tried to understand me, someone who could stand in a courtroom and fight for people who had no one else to fight for them, someone stronger than the small box he put me in. As the courtroom emptied, I walked toward the hallway, where he stood, frozen in place. He stepped aside, his breath catching just slightly, as though he couldn't quite gather himself. I paused, not to gloat, not to revel, but to look him in the eye for the first time, from a place of absolute truth. He expected me to say something sharp, something triumphant. Instead, I simply said, "I told you someday you'd understand." His mouth opened, but no words came out. I walked past him, my heels clicking down the marble corridor, each step carrying years of swallowed pride, finally released. That single moment, quiet, unplanned, became the hinge on which everything else in our family would turn. Part 1. The day he dismissed me. 1. Go 13 words. The moment I walked past my father-in-law in that courthouse hallway, something inside me shifted. But the story of how we got there stretches back through years of doubt, small wounds, and a marriage slowly bending under the weight of unspoken loyalties. I didn't realize it then, but winning that federal case didn't just change my career. It changed the entire dynamic of our family. And like most shifts in life, it didn't begin with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It began quietly, in the subtle ways respect can erode when someone decides you're not who they want you to be. For years, my marriage lived in the shadow of my father-in-law's opinions. Mark loved his father, still does, and I never wanted to disrupt that bond. But somewhere along the line, his love began to blur into deference, and deference started to feel like silence. Silence when Daniel made comments about my long work hours. Silence when he joked at Christmas that he hoped I wouldn't turn the holiday into a courtroom. Silence when he introduced me to his fishing buddies as the one keeping the lights on with her paperwork job. Always paperwork, as if the heart of my career could be reduced to staples and manila folders. In the early years of our marriage, I tried to play along. I brought casseroles to family dinners. I listened to the same stories about Daniel's glory days at the factory, the years he coached Little League, the way he kept a roof over everyone's heads after his wife died. I admired him for those things, truly. But admiration doesn't erase the sting of being misunderstood. I kept waiting for him to ask what my days looked like, what my cases were about, or even why I chose law in the first place. The question never came. Instead, he would pat my hand and say, "Emily, sweetheart, don't work too hard. Your husband needs you too. Some wounds don't bleed, they settle in the bones." Mark wasn't blind, but he was raised to avoid conflict, to smooth over tension rather than face it. Whenever I brought up how Daniel spoke to me, he would sigh and say, "He doesn't mean anything by it. That's just how Dad is." That sentence, "that's just how Dad is," became the quiet refrain that dismissed my feelings again and again. Each time I heard it, I felt myself shrink a little more. Yet, love is complicated, and marriage even more so. Mark wasn't unkind. He made me coffee every morning. He rubbed my shoulders when I stayed up late preparing for trial. He never once asked me to quit my job or slow down, but he also never stood up for me. And sometimes, silence from the person you love scars deeper than words from the person who dislikes you. Everything began to shift the year I took on the federal fraud case. I didn't choose it because it was high profile. I chose it because the victims were mostly retirees, people the system tended to forget. They reminded me of the older Americans who raised me neighbors, who saved coupons, drove worn-down trucks, and lived with dignity no matter how little they had. I couldn't bear the thought of their life savings being stolen by people who hid behind spreadsheets and forged signatures. The case consumed me. I'd leave home before sunrise and return well after dinner. There were nights when the only light in our house came from the lamp in my office. Mark tried to understand, but he didn't grasp the weight of it, the responsibility, the pressure, the stakes. And Daniel certainly didn't understand. All this over money, he grumbled once. People lose money every day. That's life. I stared at him for a long moment. These aren't gamblers or risk takers. These are elderly folks who work their whole lives for a little comfort. He waved his hand dismissively. Well, maybe if they'd been smarter with their savings. I felt something inside me fracture. From that moment on, family dinners felt colder. Mark noticed, but when he tried to bridge the gap, both sides pulled away. I couldn't pretend anymore, and Daniel didn't want to. The distance grew subtle, at first, shorter conversations, fewer invitations, but soon it turned into quiet avoidance. I focused on the case. He focused on finding new ways to dismiss my work. One Sunday afternoon, as Mark and I sat in his parents' living room, Daniel asked my husband, "So when are you two thinking about kids?" Before her career eats her whole life. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't defend me. I answered instead, "We'll decide that ourselves." Daniel smiled without warmth. "Well, just don't wait until your job burns you out. Paperwork won't take care of you in your old age." There it was, again paperwork, always diminished, always simplified, as though my life's work could be summarized in a single stack of documents. Driving home, I felt tears prick the backs of my eyes, not because he'd hurt me, but because for the first time, I wondered if Mark really saw me, saw who I was, saw what mattered to me, and whether he wanted a wife or a reflection of his father's expectations. But life rarely gives us clarity in the moment. It gives us trials, literal ones in my case. The week the trial began, my world narrowed to opening statements, witness lists, and cross-examinations. I barely slept. The stakes were enormous, hundreds of elderly victims, waiting to see whether justice would finally tilt their way. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care what Daniel thought. Not because I had grown stronger, but because the people counting on me outweighed him. Still, I carried his voice with me. Just drafts paperwork. Those words echoed every time I stood in front of the jury. And I think deep down, that echo pushed me harder. Mark attended the trial twice. Daniel attended once. He sat in the back arms, crossed as though trying to decide whether to stay or walk out. I didn't look at him, but I felt his presence, a reminder of the weight I'd carried for years. By the time the trial reached its final week, the tension in our household was palpable. Mark didn't know how to support me, and I didn't know how to bridge the emotional distance widening between us. We spoke less, slept farther apart, and began to orbit each other, like two people afraid to collide. But everything, every argument swallowed, every moment of doubt, was heading toward the day the verdict came down, toward the moment in the courtroom when the judge spoke words that finally made Daniel see me clearly. The federal fraud case didn't arrive in my life like a thunderclap. It crept in, quietly tucked inside a manila folder, handed to me by a senior partner who said almost casually, "Hayes, you might want to look at this. Could be big." He had no idea how big. No one did. But the moment I read the first affidavit, an 82-year-old widow from Terre Haute who'd lost every cent of her retirement savings, I felt something tighten inside my chest. Cases come and go, but some hold on to you. Her name was Mrs. Alderson. She wrote in shaky handwriting that she didn't want trouble, but hoped someone could at least tell me how much I truly lost. I remember sitting at my desk after midnight, staring at her words, imagining her kitchen table, the unpaid bills, the cold fear of opening envelopes she couldn't afford to answer. I knew right then the case wasn't simple bookkeeping. It was predatory theft, aimed at the elderly people who grew up trusting banks, trusting signatures, trusting promises. The more I dug, the worse it became. Dozens of retirees had been manipulated into investing their life savings into a fraudulent scheme disguised as a senior financial protection program. Emails doctored, signatures forged, phone calls scripted to prey on loneliness and fear. It made my blood boil. But at home, the gravity of what I'd taken on wasn't understood, least of all by my father-in-law. At our next Sunday dinner, Mark gently mentioned to his dad, M's taking a big federal case. Could be career-defining. Daniel barely looked up from carving the roast. Federal, huh? Sounds like a mess. Hope you're not getting dragged into politics. It's not political, I said evenly. It's about families who lost everything. Daniel chuckled. People lose money all the time. That's why you don't gamble with savings. I clenched my hands under the table. They didn't gamble. They were defrauded. He shrugged. Should have known better. That was the moment something in me hardened. Not out of anger, but clarity. You cannot convince someone who refuses to see the truth. The weeks that followed were a blur. My dining room table vanished under stacks of documents. Phone records, bank statements, hidden transactions, shell companies. I'd wake at 4 a.m. with ideas and run to jot them down before they evaporated. I stopped watching TV, stopped gardening, stopped doing anything that required more than the leftover energy I gave to breathing. Mark tried to check in. You're working yourself into the ground, he'd say softly. I'll rest after trial. But rest isn't something you postpone without consequences. My body tightened, my back stiffened, my appetite vanished. Still, I pushed on, because every night I'd picture those retirees' faces lined by years of working in factories, running small-town diners, teaching in schools, faces that reminded me of the America I grew up in. Honest people. People who deserved better. The first major break came when I traced a series of transfers from a shell corporation in Ohio to a private account in Michigan belonging to one of the orchestrators. It was the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about, if I could prove intent. But digging into that account felt like trying to peel the bark from an iron tree. There were roadblocks everywhere. Defense attorneys filed motions to delay, bury, confuse, overwhelm. They tried to drown me in paperwork, ironically enough. That irony wasn't lost on me. One night around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Mark. Dad thinks you're working too much, he said gently. Dad thinks the sun rises because he commands it, I muttered. Mark hesitated. He's worried. He thinks. I know exactly what he thinks I cut in. He thinks none of this matters. He thinks I'm wasting my time. He thinks I should be home by 6, cooking dinner, instead of fighting for people he doesn't care about. Silence. That's not fair. Isn't it? He didn't answer. In that silence, his silence cut deeper than any of Daniel's words. The next morning, I walked into the office with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I laid out my evidence-drafted motions, prepared witness lists. Each step brought me a little closer to the truth buried beneath layers of deceit. Then came the day I interviewed Mrs. Alderson in person. She wore a faded blue cardigan and held her purse tightly in her lap as if afraid I might vanish with it. When I explained the scale of the fraud tears gathered in her eyes, not for the money, but for the betrayal. My husband worked 40 years. At the mill, she whispered. We saved every extra dollar. We wanted to leave something for our granddaughter. I thought people still cared. I reached across the table and took her hand. I care, I said, and I'm not going to stop. She smiled, small but real. You remind me of my daughter, she said. She died young, but she had your fire. I carried her words like armor. By the time trial approached, I felt like I was lifting a mountain. My office piled with color-coded binders. Late nights became early mornings. Coffee replaced proper meals. And through it all, Mark and I drifted like two boats lost in fog. Not angry, just distant. And Daniel remained the weight I carried without fully acknowledging. But the closer the trial came, the more everything sharpened. Every deposition, every record, every cross-examination script. I knew the case inside and out. I breathed it. Yet, nothing could prepare me for the moment Daniel decided to attend the trial, not out of pride, but curiosity, maybe even skepticism. He sat in the back row, like a man waiting for proof of his assumptions. But what he saw wasn't the woman he dismissed for years. He saw me command the courtroom. He saw me dismantle lies with precision. He saw victims cling to my words like lifelines. And though he would never admit it, not then, not yet, I saw the first crack in the wall he had built between us. Because for the first time in a decade, he finally saw me. I knew the trial would test me, but I didn't realize my own family would become the second courtroom where I'd be judged. Standing before a jury was easier than sitting across from my father-in-law at Sunday dinner. At least jurors listened. At least they were required to keep an open mind. Daniel Hayes, on the other hand, had passed his verdict on me long before opening arguments. The trial consumed my every waking moment. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency in the defendant's statements. Every questionable ledger entry. Every witness who hesitated when answering simple questions. I was living inside a storm papers, swirling deadlines, howling, and my mind racing faster than I could breathe. Yet even in that storm, I knew exactly who I was and why I fought. It was at home, where I felt small again, shrinking under the weight of someone else's narrow expectations. One evening, during the trial's second week, Mark suggested we go to his parents' house for dinner. He said it gently, cautiously, as though approaching an injured animal. Dad just wants to see us, he said. It might help if you two talked. I almost laughed. He doesn't want to talk, Mark. He wants to critique. Mark exhaled slowly. Maybe not, but avoiding him isn't helping. He was right in a way. Distance had formed a quiet canyon between our families, but I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to be scrutinized. Not after spending hours dissecting lies for the jury. Still, part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe Daniel had softened after watching me in court. He hadn't. When we walked into the Hayes' dining room, Daniel gave me a brief glance and said, "Long week at the office. Must be exhausting staring at paperwork all day." I set my jaw so tightly, I felt it in my temples. "It's more than paperwork." He waved his hand. "All legal work is paperwork. You folks love drowning in documents." Mark tried to redirect the conversation. "Dad, you saw her in court. She's—" Daniel interrupted. "I saw a lot of talking, that's what I saw. But talking isn't winning. Talking is just noise until there's a verdict." I felt the floor tilt slightly, like a boat shifting under my feet. He had watched me fight for victims. He had watched me lead a room full of people. And still, he minimized it. I set my fork down quietly. "You know, Daniel, if you're going to dismiss everything I do, at least be honest about it instead of pretending it's harmless." The room fell silent. Even the old clock ticking on the wall seemed to pause. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm not dismissing. I'm being realistic. A job is a job. Don't make it your identity." I stared at him for a long moment, then said softly, "I don't make it my identity. You do." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The wall between us grew another inch. That night, when Mark and I got home, we sat together in the dim light of the hallway. The house felt cold, not from the weather, but from the distance stretching between us. Mark finally whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have said more." I leaned my head against the wall. "I don't need you to defend my work. I just need you to see me." He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't fully understand. Not yet. The trial intensified as the defense began attacking the credibility of victims. They claimed the retirees had misunderstood the contracts, that they were confused or forgetful. I felt anger coil inside me as I watched elderly witnesses tremble under questioning. These were people who built America's backbone. They deserved dignity. One afternoon, during a brief recess, I found Mrs. Alderson sitting alone in the hallway, hands clasped in her lap. She looked small, swallowed by the courthouse's marble walls. "Are you all right?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "It's just, they make me feel foolish, like I should have known better." I sat beside her. "You were targeted. That's not foolishness. That's cruelty." She nodded, eyes glistening. "My husband used to say the world changes too fast. Maybe he was right." I took her hand. "The world changes, but justice doesn't disappear. We'll get there." That was the moment I stopped caring about how drained I felt. I had a purpose larger than myself. And for the first time, I realized my father-in-law's opinion was not a judgment. It was noise, background static, something I could tune out if I chose to. But families have a way of pulling you back into their storms. Halfway through the trial, Daniel showed up again. I saw him slip into the back row just before the afternoon session began. I didn't acknowledge him, but I felt his eyes on me as I presented a crucial witness, a retired teacher who'd lost the house where she'd lived for 40 years. Her voice trembled as she recounted the moment she realized her savings were gone. When the defense attorney suggested she had been careless, I felt heat rise in my chest. I stood, looked the jury in the eye, and said, "Carelessness did not steal her home. Deception did." For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel didn't smirk, shift, or roll his eyes. He sat perfectly still. Later, during cross-examination, I dismantled a financial officer who had helped orchestrate the fraud. Every answer he tried to twist, I straightened. Every lie he attempted, I exposed. The tension in the courtroom was electric. When the judge finally called recess, The spectators murmured, as though they'd witnessed a storm break. As the room emptied, I caught a glimpse of Daniel. He wasn't smiling, but something had cracked in his expression, the first hairline fracture in years of certainty about who he believed I was. When the courtroom cleared, he approached me slowly. You did well up there," he said. It wasn't praise. Not yet, but it wasn't dismissal. I simply nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated. "I'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. Not someday. Not maybe. But tomorrow. For the first time, my father-in-law was choosing to watch, not to judge, but to understand. And that tiny shift changed more than I realized. The morning the crucial week of trial began, I woke before sunrise with a knot deep in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It was something heavier, something like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the wind might push you in any direction. My house was still the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. Mark was asleep in the bedroom, his back turned to my side of the bed. We hadn't argued, not exactly, but silence had grown between us, like frost creeping across a window. I dressed quietly, gathered my files, and stepped into the cold Indiana morning. The air smelled like wet leaves and distant chimney smoke, one of those early spring days that can't decide if winter is really over. Driving to the courthouse, I rehearsed every point of cross-examination. In my mind, I knew the defense would come at me hard today. They always struck hardest when the truth cornered them. And I had cornered them. Days of testimony had chipped away at their lies, and now they were desperate to shake my confidence. I tightened my fingers around the steering wheel and reminded myself, confidence wasn't something they gave me. It was something I earned. When I walked into the courthouse lobby, I saw a few of the retirees seated on benches, many of them in their Sunday clothes, the way older Americans often dress when something feels important. Mrs. Alderson, wearing her pale blue cardigan again, waved timidly. I felt a warmth in my chest as I walked over. "You didn't have to come today," I told her gently. "Oh, honey," she said, patting my hand. "I came because you always show up for us. It's the least we can do." Her words steadied me more than any amount of legal preparation could. Inside the courtroom, the energy felt different, charged, expectant, as though everyone sensed we were nearing the heart of the battle. Reporters filled the back row. A few townspeople had come in after reading stories in the local paper, and there, sitting in his now regular seat, was my father-in-law. He nodded when our eyes met. Not a smile, not a frown, just a quiet acknowledgement. A small gesture, but one that didn't exist a month earlier. I took my place at the plaintiff's table, spread out my files, and breathed deeply. The defense opened with aggression, as expected. Their lead attorney, sharp suit, sharper tongue, attempted to discredit our key witness, a retired postal worker who had lost his entire pension. "Sir," the attorney said, with feigned politeness, "isn't it true you failed to read the contract thoroughly?" The witness stammered, I trusted what they told me." "And you didn't consult a financial advisor?" "Well, no, So you made these decisions entirely on your own judgment." Something inside me snapped. I stood so quickly, my chair scraped the floor. "Objection," I said, voice steady but firm. "Victim blaming. The witness is not on trial." The judge peered over his glasses. Sustained. The defense attorney shot me a sour glance, but I didn't break eye contact. Not this time. Not ever. When it was my turn for cross-examination, I walked toward the stand with calm, measured steps. The postal worker looked at me with relief. I placed a reassuring hand on the rail. "Sir," I asked, "when you first received the call about this investment opportunity, did the representative identify themselves as part of a senior protection program?" "Yes," he said. "They said it was meant to keep seniors safe from scams." "And did that feel trustworthy to you?" "It did. I thought they were helping me." "And were you ever told the investment was high risk?" "No," he whispered. "Never." "Thank you," I said gently, then turned to the jury. This man didn't gamble. He was targeted. I saw Daniel shift in his seat as those words echoed through the courtroom. He looked at the witness as if seeing him for the first time, not as someone who should have been smarter, but as a human being misled by professionals who preyed on trust. The afternoon brought the defense's financial expert to the stand, a polished man with a glossy resume and a cold smile. He spoke in circles, using jargon meant to confuse the jury. But I had studied every page of his reports, every contradictory statement. During cross-examination, I approached the stand. "You've testified that the retirees should have known the risks correct." "Yes," he said. "And you claim the investment materials were clear." "They were." I lifted a document. "Is this your original disclosure form?" "Yes." "And this is the revised version, sent to clients?" "Yes." I held them side by side. "Could you explain why the risk paragraph in the client version is missing 3 sentences from the original?" A hush fell over the room. He adjusted his tie. "It must have been a printing error." "Printing error?" I tilted my head. "The exact 3 sentences that outline potential loss of principal convenient error." The jury leaned forward. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. But when I glanced toward the back row, what I saw surprised me most. Daniel gripping the bench with both hands, leaning in as though the truth had pulled him by the collar. When court adjourned that day, people filed out murmuring. Reporters scribbled notes. The retirees hugged each other. I packed my papers slowly, letting the adrenaline settle. As I stepped into the hallway, Daniel approached me. His expression was strange, softened, almost uncertain. You were something up there," he said quietly. I blinked. "Thank you." He swallowed hard. "Those folks, they really were taken advantage of, weren't they?" "Yes," I said gently, "they were." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing not just the facts of the case, but the weight of compassion he had overlooked his whole life. "I didn't know," he whispered. I didn't answer. Some realizations shouldn't be rushed. That night I drove home, with a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. The trial wasn't over, but something had shifted, not just in the courtroom, but between me and the man who once dismissed my entire existence with a shrug. For the first time, he saw the people I fought for. And for the first time, he saw me. The morning the verdict was delivered, the courthouse felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of what was about to unfold. I arrived early, long before the retirees or reporters, just to sit alone in the courtroom and breathe. The polished wooden benches, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the seal of the United States above the judge's bench. All of it felt like a cathedral for truth. I rested my hands on the table where I had fought for weeks and whispered to myself, "Whatever happens, you did everything you could." As people filtered in, I saw familiar faces. Mrs. Alderson clutching her purse, the retired postal worker with his shoulders hunched, a Korean War veteran, leaning on a cane, a widower whose hands always trembled. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here for closure, something many of them had been denied for years. And then Daniel walked in. He didn't hesitate at the doorway this time. He didn't shuffle or avert his eyes. He walked with purpose, wearing a clean button-down shirt that looked freshly ironed, as though he understood that this day meant something solemn. He sat in the same back row seat, but his posture was different. He wasn't leaning back in skepticism. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, ready to witness whatever truth would come. Mark arrived a few minutes later, slipping into the row beside his father. He gave me a small nod. His eyes were tired, maybe from worry, maybe from reflection, but they held something gentler than they had in weeks. It was the first time I felt him truly see the gravity of what I had been carrying. When the judge entered, the room fell still, the kind of stillness that feels like it stretches time. We all rose, then sat again in one synchronized motion, like a wave returning to shore. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "the jury has reached a verdict." My heart thudded once hard. Not for myself, my career wouldn't crumble if we lost, but for the retirees who had pinned their final hopes on this moment. Some had sold their cars to pay medical bills. Some had lost homes. Some had lost faith. And for once, the system had a chance to restore something to them. The foreperson, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, pulled into a neat bun, stood with the verdict slip in hand. She cleared her throat. "On the matter of federal financial fraud," she said, voice clear, "we find the defendants guilty on all counts." Gasps broke across the room. Then tears. Then muffled cries. A retired teacher covered her mouth with both hands. Mrs. Alderson wept openly. The postal worker bowed his head, as though someone had lifted a mountain off his back. Relief radiated through the room like heat. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle inside me like a warm stone. It wasn't joy. I felt it was release. When I opened my eyes, the judge continued. "Furthermore, this court acknowledges the extraordinary work of lead counsel in presenting a clear and compelling case. Attorney Emily Hayes, your service has reflected the highest standard of legal advocacy." People turned to look at me. The retirees clapped softly. Reporters scribbled furiously. But it was the movement in the back row that caught my attention. Daniel had risen to his feet. Not in applause, not in shock, in recognition. It was as though the man who had once dismissed me as nothing more than a woman pushing papers suddenly saw the full landscape of my work, for the first time unobstructed by pride habit or prejudice. When the judge left, the bench chaos erupted, hugging, crying, thanking reporters, shouting questions. I moved slowly through it all, embracing the people I had fought for. Each thank you felt like a stitch, mending something broken inside me. When the crowd thinned, I stepped into the hallway. Daniel was waiting. He stood with his hands at his sides, not in his pockets, the way he usually did when he felt uncomfortable. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. "Emily," he said quietly, "just my name." But it was the first time he had spoken it, without the weight of judgment attached. I approached him slowly. "Daniel." He swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology." The hallway buzzed faintly with voices from other cases, but around us, everything felt muted. I searched his face, not for sarcasm, not for condescension, but for sincerity, and it was there, fragile, new, but real. "You fought for those people," he said. "Really fought. I saw them. I saw what happened to them. I didn't understand before." I let out a breath I'd been holding for years. "I know," I said. "You weren't the only one." He winced, but nodded. I suppose I wasn't a good judge of character. No, I said softly. You just weren't ready to see me yet. We stood there for a long moment, two people reshaped by truth, acknowledging the past without letting it swallow us. Then Mark approached. He looked at his father, then at me, his eyes glistening. I'm proud of you, he whispered. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a speech, but after months of quiet distance, it was enough, more than enough. We walked out of the courthouse together, the three of us, not as a perfect family, but as people finally ready to try. The retirees gathered on the steps, taking pictures, laughing, hugging. A few waved at me. One man shouted, "God bless you, Miss Hayes." I smiled, not for the cameras, not for the victory, but for the simple truth that justice had been served, and it had changed more than just the law. It had changed us. And yet inside the joy, a quiet thought settled forgiveness isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different one. In the weeks after the verdict, life didn't snap back into place the way I expected. Justice had been served, yes, and the retirees began receiving restitution. The newspapers printed my name for several days in a row, calling me everything, from the iron-willed advocate to the quiet warrior. But inside my home, things shifted more slowly, like a season changing one breeze at a time. Mark became more attentive, not in dramatic gestures, but in small ones that mattered. He'd place a cup of coffee on my desk without saying a word. He'd ask about my cases, with genuine curiosity, not out of polite obligation. He even accompanied me once to a legal workshop, sitting quietly in the back like a husband, proud to be present. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Daniel, on the other hand, moved cautiously around me, like a man learning to use unfamiliar tools. He didn't overpraise, and he didn't apologize a second time. That was fine. I didn't need him to rewrite the past. I just needed him to stop dragging it behind us like an anchor. One Saturday morning, about 3 weeks after the verdict, he called me. Normally, I would brace myself when I saw his name on my phone. But this time, his voice held nothing sharp. "Emily," he said, clearing his throat, "I was wondering if you and Mark wanted to come over for supper tomorrow. I'm making pot roast." Daniel making pot roast was as common as snowfall in July. "We'd love to," I said, surprised. The next day, when we arrived, the house smelled like herbs and slow-cooked beef. There was a gentleness in the air I couldn't quite explain. He set the table himself, another rarity. And when we sat down, he looked at me the way a man looks at a puzzle finally solved. "I read those court articles," he said, lifting his fork. "Folks sure think highly of you." I smiled softly. "I'm glad it brought them closure." He nodded. "Closure," he repeated, almost tasting the word. "Never gave that much thought when I was younger. I figured you work hard, keep going, don't look back." He paused. "But I see now. Sometimes people need to know someone cares enough to fight for them." I met his eyes. "Everyone deserves that." He looked down at his plate, swallowed, then said something that landed deeper than he might have realized. "You did good, Emily. Real good." It wasn't his style to gush. That simple sentence, spoken without fanfare, meant more than any effusive speech. I felt something settle inside me, something that had been restless for years. As the evening went on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: Mark's garden, my next case, and Daniel's plans to build a new shed. We laughed more easily than we had in a long time. The heaviness that used to hover over our dinners like a storm cloud seemed to evaporate. And somewhere in that gentle, ordinary moment, I realized I no longer felt the need to prove myself to him. That burden had washed away the moment he stood in that courtroom hallway, looking at me not as a disappointment, but as a person capable of changing lives. But reconciliation isn't one moment, it's many, and ours continued quietly. A few weeks later, I stopped by his house to drop off some documents Mark had left behind. Daniel was outside, sanding a wooden board on his workbench. When he saw me, he nodded toward an empty stool. "Sit a minute." I did. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about all those folks you helped. People my age. People who probably felt embarrassed to admit they were scammed." He set down the sandpaper and looked at me directly. "It takes guts to face your mistakes, more guts than it takes to pretend you never make any." The wind carried the scent of sawdust between us. "I guess what I'm saying is, you opened my eyes. About them. About you." He shrugged. "About myself." I let his words land gently, not as repayment, not as vindication, but as the beginning of something better. Over time, Daniel began sharing parts of himself I had never seen before. Stories of his years at the factory, how he struggled after his wife passed, how afraid he'd been of growing old, of losing relevance, of feeling useless. I realized in the softness of those stories that his dismissiveness had always come from a place of fear. Fear that the world was moving too fast for him, that younger generations would forget people like him. And in that recognition, compassion bloomed where resentment once lived. One evening, as I was leaving his house, he stopped me at the door. "Emily," he said, almost whispering, "I know I can't change everything I've said over the years, but I want to try to be better. I want to understand more, if you'll let me." I felt my throat tighten. "I will," I said. "I want that too." And that was when I understood something. Powerful forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it frees the future. As summer came, the retirees I'd represented began rebuilding their lives. Some sent me cards. Some sent homemade cookies. One sent a photograph of herself smiling beside a freshly painted porch she'd saved up to repair. I kept every note, every small token, not because they praised me, but because they reminded me why justice matters. One afternoon while I was organizing my office, I found Mrs. Alderson's handwritten affidavit, the shaky script, the quiet plea for help. I traced the edges of the paper and felt tears prick my eyes. Not sadness, gratitude. Her voice had started this journey, and in fighting for her, I had unknowingly fought for myself, against dismissal, against doubt, against the weight of someone else's limited imagination. Later that week, Daniel dropped by unexpectedly. He knocked softly on our door, holding a small wooden box he had built. Inside was a hand-carved plaque that read, "For Emily, who stands up when others cannot." My breath caught. "It's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but I wanted you to know I see you now. I really do." I touched the plaque gently. "Thank you," I whispered. "This means more than you know." As he walked back to his truck, I realized something profound. Sometimes the justice we seek isn't in the courtroom. Sometimes it's in the quiet ways people learn to grow, to soften, to meet us halfway. And if there's anything I'd tell those listening, especially those in their later years, it's this: never believe it's too late to see someone differently. Never think pride is more valuable than understanding. And never doubt that one act of courage, whether in a courtroom or around a kitchen table, can change the story of a family. If my story touched you or reminded you of someone in your own life, I hope you'll share it. Sometimes the right story at the right moment becomes the beginning of healing.